I think we're seeing a maturing of how both investors and preparers are viewing disclosure standards. It's not just something they have to do because somebody else is making them do it. They can actually change that narrative in saying, well, this is an opportunity for them. It's a new tool set to inform and improve their decision making for the betterment of their stakeholders over the long term.
Welcome to Sustainability Leaders. I'm Michael Torrance, Chief Sustainability Officer at BMO. On this show, we will talk with leading sustainability practitioners from the corporate, investor, academic, and NGO communities to explore how this rapidly evolving field of sustainability is impacting global investment, business practices, and our world.
The views expressed here are those of the participants and not those of Bank of Montreal, its affiliates, or subsidiaries.
On today's episode, I'm joined by Michael Jantzi, a member of the International Sustainability Standards Board. The ISSB was formed in 2021 to develop a baseline for sustainability disclosures focused on the needs of investors and the financial markets. Michael has 30 years of experience in responsible investment and sustainable finance and was the founder of Sustainalytics. He joined the ISSB from Morningstar, where he served as Managing Director of ESG Strategy. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thank you for the invitation. Really happy to have the opportunity to talk with you today, Michael.
Michael, for the benefit of our listeners, could you please explain the mission of the ISSB, why it's necessary, and generally, what are you seeking to accomplish?
Yeah, maybe it makes sense just to put the ISSB into some context because we're part of the IFRS Foundation, and that may not be a household word for everybody, but the IFRS Foundation is the organization that has developed and oversees financial reporting disclosure standards around the world. And those disclosure standards, those financial reporting standards, are in use in more than 140 countries. So it was the foundation that made the decision to establish the ISSB. So we are a part of, say, the mainstream plumbing of disclosures globally. And so the IFRS Foundation went through a consultation process, and both investors and companies and other stakeholders said that there was a need for high-quality global sustainability disclosure standards because the alphabet soup of disclosures around the world when it came to sustainability risks and opportunities was no longer fit for purpose. It was complex, it was costly for both investors and preparers. And so that was why the IFRS Foundation decided to establish the ISSB. And so our mission, quite frankly, was to develop disclosure standards that would lead to decision useful information for investors. So our disclosures are designed so that entities need to put into the market those sustainability-related risks and opportunities that they believe are material to their business so that investors have the decisions that they make to evaluate that company's prospects moving forward over the short, medium, and long term. So our job, simply put, was to create an environment where investors got the information that they told us they needed to make good decisions on behalf of their plan members and clients.
The ISSB is relatively new, having only been around for about 3 years, but you guys have really accomplished quite a lot. Are you able to take us through what were some of the key milestones and accomplishments of the ISSB to date?
Yeah, I think one of the first milestone was just the fact that, the IFRS Foundation made the decision to establish the ISSB. Because for many years, the idea that sustainability-related information was important to investors and to financial markets more broadly had been growing, but the idea of sort of putting it on the same level or foothold as financial reporting disclosures, that was a milestone in and of itself. So I think, the very fact that we were established is important. And then the ISSB itself, the 14 members of the board, we didn't even come together until, July of 2022. And that's when the standard setting process really began. So I think the other important milestone to keep in mind is from that running start, certainly, we released our first two standards in June of 2023. So what it meant was in essentially 1 year's time, we launched our first two standards, IFRS S1, which was our general standards and financial disclosures, and IFRS S2, which was climate-related disclosures, into the market. And if you know anything about standard setting, especially financial reporting disclosures, they historically have taken a lot more time to get to market. So I think it was a real milestone to get those two groundbreaking global baseline oriented standards into the market so quickly. And then I would say subsequently, it's about adoption, but again, these are game changers, Michael, in a couple of different ways. I mean, again, we're a sister board to the International Accounting Standards Board, which means our standards are as much about the disclosure of sustainability related risks and opportunities, but they're also about then connecting that to the financial disclosures. And we're moving from a voluntary reporting environment into a mandatory reporting environment. So again, now, I think another milestone has been just the pace of adoption of our first two standards. Again, they were just released in June of 2023, and here we are. We already have more than 30 jurisdictions around the world engaging with the ISSB standards on the path to adoption. And those jurisdictions represent about 57% of global GDP. So again, I think the formation was a milestone. Getting the standards out, I'll say in record time, was a milestone. And now we're seeing, robust adoption or regulatory adoption in jurisdictions around the world. So I think those are three important milestones.
Michael, could you just elaborate on the substantive content of the two standards that have been released? What are they focused on?
Well, IFRS S1, or S1 as we refer to it, is the general disclosure standard. So you can think of it as our conceptual framework. But essentially what it does, Michael, is it demands that entities, companies, disclose material sustainability-related risks and opportunities. And material means financial materiality. So those risks and opportunities on the sustainability side of things that companies believe might impact their prospects moving forward. So their cash flows, their access to capital, and cost of capital moving forward. And then that first standard also sets out the basic tenets by which they need to report or disclose this information, which are very much aligned with the principles that have been underpinned in financial reporting standards for many years. So, are familiar to preparers, to investors, to assurance providers, and so on. So that's S1, the conceptual framework. IFRS S2, or again, S2 as we refer to it, is climate-related disclosures. So that is providing more information for preparers in regards to how they need to approach the disclosure of climate-related risks and opportunities. And both of the standards have incorporated well-used and well-respected disclosure frameworks. So, for example, both IFRS S1 and S2 have incorporated the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures architecture. So they follow a very familiar pattern of disclosure for the market, strategies, risks, governance, metrics, and targets. So again, our job at the ISSB was not to add to the alphabet soup of largely voluntary standards that were out there. We didn't want to add another letter to the alphabet. We wanted to consolidate and bring some of these other frameworks or investor relation frameworks together. So that's why you see an incorporation of the TCFD architecture. You see the incorporation of industry-based standards. So SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board work, is now part of the IFRS Foundation. Those standards are incorporated into S1 and S2 as well. So that provides a little bit of an overview of what is in each of those standards.
Michael, you've been at the forefront of the integration of ESG and sustainability into finance throughout your impressive career. How have investor views on the importance of ESG disclosure changed over that time? And what are the needs of investors that the ISSB is seeking to meet?
Yeah, you mentioned off the top that I've been doing this for over 3 decades. So I go back a little bit in regards to how I've seen the importance of sustainability disclosures evolve. When I started back in this space, it's fair to say that there were investors that did look at sustainability risks and opportunities as part of their process, but there were not a lot of them around the world. But that continued to evolve. And I would say that over time, it was nice to have that type of information for investors. So there's no question that they felt it was important to have a sense of what risks and opportunities were lurking out there in the sustainability space, because it was a nice addition to the work that they were already doing with traditional financial metrics and decision-making frameworks and so on. And I think, that developed over time. Certainly, when you think back to some of the governance challenges that the market faced with Enron and WorldCom and Tyco and similar governance challenges around the world, that was sort of the door opening to this idea that issues outside of the strict definition of financial data could matter to an investment decision. You saw the formation of the Principles for Responsible Investment in about 2006, which was both an indication that investors were paying more attention to sustainability information as part of their decision process, but it was also a catalyst to further the development of the responsible investing space. But something started to shift, I would say, around 2015 or 2016, Michael, and I would suggest that sustainability information stopped being a nice to have for investors and became a need to have for investors. And I think the catalyst for that was the understanding that climate change presented some potentially serious and significant risks and opportunities for companies and therefore for investors. And as you well know, when something becomes a need to have in the capital markets, what was once fit for purpose is no longer fit for purpose. So this environment of largely voluntary disclosure standards, again, it was this alphabet soup as it's been described by both investors and companies alike, was complex, it was costly. So for investors, they were very clear in their responses to the consultations from the ISSB and so on that they invest their capital globally, right? And so what they needed were high quality, globally aligned standards so that when they're investing across the market, they're getting access to comparable or comparable data. And then the other thing that was important to them was that they wanted to see that data from a verification standpoint on par with how financial reporting disclosures have long been practiced. So the fact is that having sustainability data, again, not just be comparable and comparable across companies, across markets, but to know that it was going to be verified and assured and audited was really important to them. So that's been sort of the evolution on the investor side. On the preparer side, I think where this is going to end up is still a story that's being written. I think that for many years, disclosures on the sustainability side were viewed as predominantly, a matter of compliance. It was something that companies had to do in order to placate the investor base or a broader range of stakeholders. But I do think that is beginning to change. I think that increasingly, especially at the board of director level, board directors are understanding that the ISSB, for example, isn't just a compliance exercise. It is a framework that can help them identify, and it provides the tools to help the board of directors and senior management identify what sustainability-related risks and opportunities can be material to their business moving forward, the type of things that should be informing their strategy and decision making. So I think, again, moving from compliance to a strategy conversation, and then also clearly viewing the ISSB standards as a way then to frame those issues and to better communicate with investors or lenders or those institutions that are allocating capital or could be allocating capital in their direction. So again, I think we're seeing a maturing, if I can put it that way, of how both investors and preparers are viewing disclosure standards. It's not just something they have to do because somebody else is making them do it. They can actually change that narrative and are changing that narrative in saying, well, this is an opportunity for them. It's a new tool set to inform and improve their decision making for, again, the betterment of their stakeholders over the long term.
The ISSB is looking to have domestic adoption of the standards around the world, either by accounting standards bodies or even by securities regulators. Can you give us an overview of the pace and the nature of that adoption and any particular opportunities or challenges that you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. At the ISSB, when we talk about adoption, we also talk about market adoption or voluntary adoption, which is about investors and preparers using the standards. So, maybe what I'll do is I'll focus on the voluntary adoption side, first of all. And the support that we've had from investors and players across the financial markets has been strong, consistent, and it's much appreciated by the ISSB. And I will say, support from investors, it's investors of all shapes and sizes from all parts of the world. And again, it's because that idea of having a global baseline of sustainability disclosures that are focused on disclosure of information that is financially material is just so very important to them. And so we're seeing, again, investors around the world being very public about their support for the ISSB's work. And again, that's across jurisdictions, including, large investors that, they're global investors that based in the United States. We're also seeing companies around the world embracing, the ISSB standards and undertaking the processes and changes and building capacity to allow them to set themselves up for success as they begin to now disclose to the ISSB standards around the world. But when people think about adoption of the ISSB standards, they most often will focus on, well, what are the jurisdictions that are on the pathway to making them mandatory? So what are the regulatory adoption pathways that companies are taking? And again, from our perspective at the ISSB, we're very pleased with both the number and the pace of the regulatory adoption journeys that we're seeing all around the world. It's, jurisdictions, developing countries, less developed economies, there are large countries, small countries, and they come from every corner of the globe. So if you look at Asia, you've got countries like China, including Hong Kong, Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, embracing the ISSB, Australia, jurisdictions across Africa, including Nigeria, for example, important markets there that are embracing the ISSB because they believe that if the companies in their jurisdictions are using the global baseline of disclosure standards, it will help them attract global investment capital. So strong business case in Africa. Also in Latin America or LATAM, we're seeing countries like Brazil, Mexico, Chile on an adoption journey for the ISSB. And then, of course, here in Canada as well. And in Canada, again, we have a national standard setter, the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board. We're very much aligned with the ISSB global baseline, both S1 and S2. In Canada, we've seen strong support for our work in other regulatory bodies. So, for example, our federal prudential regulator here, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, also the Quebec prudential regulator, have based their climate regulations on ISSB. So there's alignment there. So, that journey, both on the voluntary or market adoption side and on the regulatory side around the world, has been very warmly received by myself and my colleagues at the ISSB because, again, it's only been 18 months since our initial standards were released. So we're really happy with the momentum that we're seeing in the market, again, on both the regulatory and voluntary adoption side of the coins.
What are some of the unique challenges in the United States to domestic adoption of the ISSB? The US, of course, doesn't widely adopt IFRS standards. What's your take on what's happening in the US and what will it look like in terms of the ISSB's rollout of its standards in that jurisdiction?
Yeah, it's a really important question, obviously, for those stakeholders that are listening from the North American jurisdiction. So I'm happy to talk about the challenges with the U.S. situation. From North America, though, I should also mention, Mexico. And Mexico is a jurisdiction that is on a regulatory adoption journey. The one thing in Mexico, and this may sound very familiar to Canadian listeners, there's a regulatory fragmentation in Mexico. So, in Mexico, you've got sort of three different regulators, one that looks at, the capital markets side, another that regulates insurance companies, another that regulates pension funds, for example. So while the capital markets regulator went to the market with a public consultation looking for disclosures or regulating disclosures that will be very much aligned with S1 and S2, it doesn't cover all financial institutions across the market because they are regulated by other bodies. So what will happen in that jurisdiction is hard to say, but we're on the road to adoption, but there's still a way to go. In the United States, it's an important conversation for Canadian stakeholders, obviously, because our economies are so connected, our capital markets specifically are so connected. But as you mentioned, there was never any anticipation that the United States was going to follow a regulatory adoption path with respect to the ISSB because, as you highlighted, it's not reporting to the IFRS accounting standards. It uses U.S. GAAP. But the U.S. is a robust voluntary adoption market. So if you look at how the investment community is reacting in the United States, again, as I mentioned earlier, there's very strong support for the ISSB standards from U.S. headquartered investment firms, largely because they invest globally. And again, they need that global baseline so there's comparable information coming so they can make decisions across their vast network of portfolios and so on. So again, in the United States, you have the investor community very supportive of the ISSB, regardless of what any regulatory, initiatives are underway. Now, there are state regulatory initiatives in place, most predominantly in California. Again, that could have some impact on Canadian preparers and investors, so we'll have to see what happens there. But I think in the U.S., Michael, the other thing on the company side that's happening is, despite, again, an absence of a regulatory framework around this, is you're seeing companies understanding where the direction of travel is going. And the fact is that with the ISSB, there are similar sustainability-related disclosures happening in Europe. They recognize, again, U.S. companies have a global investor base. Those investors are expecting that comparable data from U.S. companies, just like they are from other entities around the world. And so U.S. companies understand that if they are going to have the relationship with their investors, if they are going to continue to have access to the capital they require, both from domestic and global investors, they're going to have to think about the ISSB disclosure standards again, despite what the regulatory environment might say. So I think for Canada and Canadian preparers and Canadian investors, it's that voluntary adoption side in the U.S. that's really important to keep in mind.
There's the other side of the spectrum where there's some very detailed and robust disclosure requirements emerging in other jurisdictions, like the EU with the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So one of the big questions I know on many sustainability professionals' minds is around interoperability, because that can become a really big challenge for companies or issuers that are trying to adopt the ISSB, but also comply with other expectations. How is the ISSB addressing that question of interoperability?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because again, going back to why we were established was to address this alphabet soup. And, companies were very clear that it was complex, it was costly to have to report to, different frameworks around the world. So you're right. Europe has, with the CSRD, they were already in place or moving ahead before the ISSB was established. And so I think it's important that you use the word interoperability as opposed to alignment, because The ISSB, as I said, our sole focus is on providing decision useful information to investors. That is why we exist. CSRD, or the European Sustainability Disclosure, exists because of a public policy mandate. I mean, Europe is very clear that they want to see assets flow in a particular direction to support the transition to a lower carbon economy. And so while we're a financial materiality focused disclosure framework or standards at the ISSB, Europe is what they would refer to as a double materiality disclosure framework. So it's not just about financial materiality, it's about impact. So obviously it would be impossible for us to have complete alignment. But interoperability is really important because what that says is, to the extent that we're focused, both standards are focused on financial materiality, we need to make sure that if you're reporting to the ISSB standards, that fulfills the obligation for the European standards, or at least the component of the European standards that focused on financial materiality. And so I can tell you that there has been a great deal of effort on both sides of the ISSB and Europe to ensure that when it comes to climate disclosures, that there is full interoperability for companies, so they're not facing this complexity. And the good news is that with very few exceptions, if you use the ISSB standards as sort of your passport to reporting into Europe, you will find you're fulfilling, all but a very few of the disclosure metrics that you need to disclose in Europe from the financial materiality side. So we have developed an interoperability guide alongside our European colleagues. And what that allows companies to do is start with the ISSB standards as an example. The guide highlights where those standards are absolutely aligned, but maybe more importantly, in those few exceptions, it highlights where if you're reporting to the ISSB standards, you may have to have a little bit of additive information to fulfill the European standards. But that additive information isn't onerous in large part because there's been so much work on ensuring that interoperability on most of the metrics. So, we're very pleased about that. There was a lot of goodwill, a lot of hard work on both sides, as I've said. So that interoperability with Europe, at least in regards to climate disclosures, is something that I think is really meaningfully positive for preparers as they're looking at how to deal with still two different sustainability disclosure standards.
So in terms of the publication of S1, that's covered general sustainability disclosures as well as climate. What will be the future work streams of the ISSB? Are there any priority areas that you'll be focusing on going forward?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, we're very public in regards to all of the work that we do, including what our work plan is going to look like over the next number of years. And we went through an extensive consultation on that. I mean, the one thing that's very clear is our number one priority is continuing to support the implementation and adoption of IFRS S1 and S2 around the world. And as we've talked about, that process is going well. But when we're looking at what are the areas for potential standard setting looking forward, the market, as part of our consultation, came back and we decided that the issues that were being talked about the most by our primary stakeholders were biodiversity, ecosystem services or nature-related risks and opportunities, and human capital. Those are two areas that we have embarked on a very extensive and comprehensive research process. So again, we haven't decided to move into standard setting in those areas, Michael, but those are the two areas that we're exploring whether standard setting is necessary and whether the ISSB has a role. So we're looking at, what are the investor demands for information in this area? What is the business case, for example, nature-related or human capital-related risks and opportunities, what impact do they have on an entity's prospects? Where are the gaps or the information needs that investors have? So if they are interested in these areas and they're using information, where are those gaps? Where are the things that they'd like to have more information from companies, but they simply cannot get, or they can't get, again, on the comparable or assured level? So those are the types of things we're looking into. I think the other hint of the direction of travel for us will be in looking at sort of the strategic partnerships and initiatives that we have in place. So one of those is with the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI. So we've been very clear, again, in regards to the interoperability conversation, that we're going to work very closely with the GRI to make sure that we can find a way, or the hope would be to find a way that there's seamless reporting in place for preparers who are interested in looking at both the financial materiality, which again is our focus at the ISSB, but then broader impact reporting, which of course has been the bread and butter of the GRI for more than 25 years. So there's a commitment there to continue working very closely with them. We recently announced that we were taking over the disclosure-related materials of the TPT, the UK Transition Planning Task Force. And so we know that transition plans are something that are high atop the agenda of both investors and preparers globally. And there's been calls from the securities regulators globally and others that ISSB maybe take a closer look at that to ensure, again, that the direction of travel there doesn't lead to fragmentation and, again, an alphabet soup of disclosures around transition plans. So taking on the responsibility for those disclosure materials has been important. And so I think you can expect the ISSB to look more closely at that area. We've already put those materials up on our website, on our Knowledge Hub, so that's already begun. But there would be some indications of where the work plan is going to be focused over the next 2 years or so.
Well, thank you, Michael, for your time. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I think very appreciative of the opportunity to speak with you and to your stakeholders. Again, I think that if you look at the direction of travel, it's clear, but there's still lots of work to be done. So, what we're talking about here, Michael, is simply ensuring that the appropriate information is getting into the market so that those who have decisions for allocating capital have the information that they need. That's what we're talking about here. We're just talking about information to make good decisions. And so I would ask your listeners if they have an opportunity to participate in the consultation processes that are going on in jurisdictions around the world, whether those consultation processes are with standard setters locally or regulatory authorities, prudential regulators, securities regulators, whatever they might be. Please take the opportunity, take the time to submit a response in support of the ISSB standards and support of the global baseline, because, those public consultations matter. I will tell you that ISSB and other standard setters, regulators pay a great deal of attention to what market participants are saying. And so I would encourage you as a listener base to participate in those processes, even though I know it takes time out of what's already a very busy schedule for people.
Great. Thanks so much again, Michael, for your time. Thanks for listening to Sustainability Leaders. This podcast is presented by BMO. You can find our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. Press the follow button if you want to get notified when new episodes are published. We value your input, so please leave a rating, review, and any feedback that you might have, or visit us at bmo.com/sustainability leaders. Our show and resources are produced with support from BMO's marketing team and Puddle Creative. Until next time, thanks for listening, and have a great week.
For BMO disclosures, please visit bmocm.com/podcast/disclaimer